Paradies. The Ice Lady. The cold is the first thing that is remembered. Not the cold of a winter's day by the window, with a hot cup of tea in your hands. No, this is another cold one, a cold that settles in the bones and stays, like a cursed tenant, a cold that burns the skin, freezes the lungs with each breath of air, and worst of all, freezes any glimmer of hope, until it becomes brittle, until it is reduced to dust. On the Baltic coast, near the free city of Danzig, the wind blows mercilessly, laden with salt and humidity that pierces even the thickest clothes. It is a landscape of wild and melancholy beauty, endless white sand beaches, deep pine forests that whisper ancient stories, and an immense sky, often a low and menacing gray. And in the midst of that powerful nature, in a corner forgotten by compassion, there existed a place, a name that for tens of thousands became the last word they heard, Stutthof. It was not Auschwitz with its cynical door and its industrial scale of death. It was not Treblinka with its railway station facade. Stutthof was smaller, more intimate in his horror. A concentration camp that began in 1939 to eliminate the Polish intelligentsia from the region, and that, over time, was transformed into an extermination camp, complete with its own gas chamber and crematorium. On its reduced scale, the brutality was not anonymous. The faces of the executioners were known, their voices, their laughter, their particular methods of torture were remembered. And in the heart of this microcosm of hell, among the hundreds of SS guards and officers, one name stands out, engraved in fire, and above all, ice, in the memory of the survivors, Paradies. She was a young woman, German, of the kind that the National Socialist regime extolled as their Aryan ideal. Blonde, with a strong constitution, with a look that could be cold as steel. She became Aufseherin, a female guard, not by chance, but by conviction. And in that position, in that small kingdom of pain where his word was law, he discovered not only a function, but a vocation, a sinister and deeply personal creativity for cruelty. His name is not remembered for the bureaucratic efficiency of an Eichmann, but for the palpable, almost tangible enjoyment he extracted from the suffering of others. She became an artisan of pain, and her workshop was the punishment block. Their tool of choice was deceptively simple, and it was available in abundance: ice water. In his hands, a bucket, a hose, a barrel ceased to be banal objects to be transformed into instruments of prolonged and exquisite agony. Drowning was not his goal. What she sought was the slow freezing, the public humiliation, the systematic destruction of the spirit through the body. This story, the one we are going to go through together, is not only the chronicle of an evil woman. That would be too simple, and evil is rarely simple. This is a story about the chasm that can open up within any human being when given permission to look at others as less than human. It is a reflection on the nature of absolute power and how it can corrupt every last particle of decency. It is a journey to the limits of human resistance. Both those who suffered and those who, like Ewa, gave in completely to darkness. It is also the story of the voices that the regime and its servants tried to silence forever. Voices of women, mostly Jewish, but also Polish, Russian, who found in the depths of their being a strength that neither the cold, nor the hunger, nor the cruelty of Paradies could completely break. Their testimonies, whispered through time, are what allow us today to reconstruct this dark chapter. Join us on this journey. We do not do it out of morbidity, but out of a deep need to understand. To look the beast in the face, however uncomfortable it may be, to recognize its features and make sure that it never roams freely again. To honor those who fell by remembering not only how they died, but how they lived their last days and the strength they showed. To make sure that the cold of Stutthof, that all-pervasive cold, never takes over our world again. Chapter 1. The Echo of the Cold. The sound of the Baltic Sea in winter is a funeral monologue. The waves, heavy and slow, crash against the shore with a thud, as if the ocean itself were exhausted. The water is the color of molten lead, and the foam that crowns the waves looks dirty, tired. The air is loaded with salt and icy humidity that seeps through the tiniest cracks, through the pores of the skin, until it penetrates the very soul. A few kilometers from this desolate coast, the landscape transforms into a dense forest of tall, thin pines, whose branches whisper in the wind, telling each other secrets that no one else wants to hear. It is here, in this place of almost supernatural beauty, that human beings decided to build their own version of hell. The journey to Stutthof often began on the crowded platforms of Danzig station. Cattle wagons, hermetic, where the bodies piled up like bales, hungry, thirsty, terrified. The rattle of wheels on the rails was the soundtrack of a journey of no return. When the heavy doors were thrown open, the first breath of air was a knock. Cold, yes, but also that smell. A smell that never, until the last day of their lives, would be forgotten by those who inhaled it. It was a nauseating mixture of thick, greasy smoke, of cheap bleach that could not hide the stench of excrement, of disease, of sweat, of fear, and underneath it all, a disgusting sweetness, the aroma of burning human flesh. It was the smell of industrialized death. And then, the voices, the shouts in German, high-pitched, full of visceral contempt, the barking of dogs, eager to bite, the crying of children, the crunch of boots against the icy gravel. In the midst of that initial chaos, a figure began to stand out for the newcomers. He was not a tall SS man, but a woman, young, in the bluish-gray uniform of the Aufseherinnen, impeccable. His face, framed by the blonde hair pulled back severely, was hard, expressionless. His eyes, pale blue, swept over the prisoners with the cold curiosity of an insect-watching entomologist. Those eyes were not looking for humanity. They were looking for weakness. They were looking for disobedience. They were looking for an excuse. It was Iwa Paradies. At just 22 years old, she possessed an authority that emanated from her like toxic radiation. His black boots, always perfectly polished, marked a clear and ominous rhythm against the ground of the field. Each step was a reminder. I have the power, and you are nothing. I remember the first time I saw her, whispers the voice of Anya, a Polish survivor whose memory guides us through this hell. It was a gray day, like all of them. We arrived after a 3-day journey in a windowless carriage. We were hungry, disoriented, and there she was, standing by the front door. He didn't scream. I didn't need to. I just watched. His look was the most terrifying. It wasn't a look of hate. It wasn't angry. Empty, as if he were looking through us, as if we were ghosts or stones. And then his eyes fell on a woman carrying her daughter, a girl of perhaps 5 years old. The woman stumbled, exhausted. Iwa approached slowly. He didn't say a word. He pulled out his rubber baton and hit the woman in the back with brutal force. The woman fell, screaming. The girl was crying. Ewa just turned around and walked on, as if he had crushed a cockroach. I knew then that we were in the hands of someone who had no soul. The camp itself was an expanse of long, low barracks made of wood blackened by damp and soot. Muddy streets that became a viscous quagmire with the thaw, barbed wire everywhere, topped with signs showing a skull, and always the smoke. It rose from the crematorium's chimney, a low, square brick structure that never stopped working. The smoke was the soul of the camp, its breath poisoned. In the mornings, thick black smoke. In the afternoons, it is clearer. Sometimes, if the wind blew in the right direction, you could see sparks and bone fragments rising into the sky. A macabre rain that settled on everything, everyone. Life in Stutov was a brutal equation designed to subtract. Insufficient food minus backbreaking work equals slow death. The rations were a crust of bread stale as a stone, a watery soup that looked more like dirty water, sometimes a piece of rancid margarine. The work, endless. Unloading construction materials, digging trenches in the frozen earth, working in nearby armaments factories. Physical weakness was a crime punishable by death. The disease, a firm sentence. But for some, like Iwa Paradies, the countryside was not a place of deprivation, but of opportunity. It was a miniature realm where they could exert absolute control over life and death. And Ewa found her particular dominance in the Straf block, the punishment block. It was the barracks from which no one came out alive. Prisoners deemed troublesome. Those who had tried to escape, those who had been caught with an extra piece of bread, or simply those who, on a bad day, had caught the attention of the wrong guard, were sent there. And it was in the Straf block where Iwa Paradies perfected her personal stamp, her signature on the book of torture, ice water. It was not an improvised punishment. It was a meticulous ritual, almost a perverse ceremony. She supervised the preparation herself. A wooden barrel, or sometimes several, were filled to the brim with water drawn from the well. In the middle of winter, the temperature of that water was below freezing, about to freeze. It was a thick, deadly liquid. They called you by your number, not your name, Anya recalls, her voice still seeming to tremble with the memory of the cold. You knew that if you were assigned to the Straf block, your fate was cast. But if it was Ewa who chose you for the bath, then you wished you had been sent straight to the gas chamber. It was a faster, cleaner death. The scene always developed in the same way, with a sinister choreography. The prisoner was dragged to the courtyard of the punishment block. Iwa, standing, his boots firmly planted in the frozen mud, held the rubber hose or pointed to the barrel with a nonchalant gesture. He ordered other prisoners to undress the condemned woman. Nudity was the first phase of humiliation, the destruction of dignity. The body, already emaciated by hunger, was exposed to the cold of the air, and the skin stood on end. It became like a goose. Then the flood began. The first jet of water was always the most shocking, a sharp and icy blow that took your breath away. A pain so sharp and sudden that it provoked a muffled scream, a gasp of pure shock. Iwa was directing the jet precisely, to the face to drown out the screams, to the chest to paralyze the heart, on the back to make the already numb skin burn, cube after bucket. or the constant and relentless flow of the hose. The woman's body began to succumb. The tremors were violent, uncontrollable, as if his whole being was shaking in a desperate attempt to generate heat. The lips turned blue, then purple. The skin, of a cadaverous white, was marked with livid spots. The teeth chattered with a blood-curdling noise. The sound of despair made music. What terrified me the most, Anya's voice confesses, was not the pain, although the pain was unbearable. It was slowness. She was not in a hurry. He paced around you, watching every spasm, every moan. His eyes shone with a kind of scientific interest, as if he were conducting an experiment. How long can a human body endure this? At what point does the mind break? Sometimes he would come up to you and whisper, "Are you still here? You're more resilient than you look." And then he laughed. A low laugh, which did not come from the throat, but from the chest. A laugh that made your blood cold more than water. That laughter is the sound I still hear in my nightmares. The end of the ordeal came when the body, exhausted, could no longer tremble. The woman lay in the mud, motionless, staring blankly, in a state of advanced hypothermia. Sometimes he died right there. His heart surrendered to the cold. Other times, she was dragged back to the barracks, where death reached her hours later, between fevers and delirium. For Iwa Paradies, it was just the end of a show. He cleaned his hands, if they had gotten wet, and left, his duty accomplished. He had reaffirmed his power. She had proven that she was the mistress of life and death in her little kingdom of mud and barbed wire. But what forges such a person? How does a 22-year-old girl become this architect of suffering? Evil does not arise out of nowhere. It is a seed that needs fertile soil to grow. To understand Ewa Paradies, we must leave the cold of Stutthof and travel back in time, to the Germany where she was born, and that, with its ideological poison, molded her to be the perfect guardian of its darkness. Chapter 2. The Hatred Factory. Before the bluish-gray uniform, there was the school apron. Before the boots echoing in the mud of Stutthof, there were the simple shoes of a girl running around the streets of her city. Ewa Paradies was born in 1920, in the town of Lauenburg, in Pomerania, a region that today belongs to Poland. Its arrival in the world coincided with the birth of the Weimar Republic, a democratic experiment that rose from the ashes of defeat in the First World War, and was marked from its first day by instability, crisis, and a deep sense of national humiliation. Let's imagine that Germany, streets full of mutilated veterans begging for a piece of bread, mothers who had lost their children in the trenches, husbands who had returned destroyed, physically and mentally. The hyperinflation of 1923 turned money into worthless paper. People brought wheelbarrows full of bills to buy a loaf of bread. A lifetime of savings evaporated in a matter of days. Hunger was a constant presence, a ghost that sat at the table in every home. To a girl growing up in this environment, the world must have seemed a deeply unsafe, chaotic, and unfair place. And in the midst of this chaos, a voice began to rise, first as a distant murmur, then as thunder rumbling around every corner. He was the voice of Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party. He was not talking about economic complexities or reconciliation. He spoke in a simple, visceral language that anyone, even a child, could understand. He spoke of guilt, and he pointed his finger. They told the Germans that they were not to blame for their misery. It was the fault of others, of those who had signed the Treaty of Versailles, which had humiliated Germany, from the Bolsheviks who wanted to destroy their way of life, and above all, of the Jews. They were portrayed as a dark and conspiratorial force, parasites sucking the blood of the German nation, responsible for all its misfortunes. It was a toxic message, but incredibly seductive. It offered a simple explanation for complex problems. He offered a scapegoat. And most importantly, it offered hope. A poisoned hope, based on hatred, but hope nonetheless. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by the sinister genius of Joseph Goebbels, was ubiquitous and brutally effective. It was not limited to political rallies. She sneaked into homes through the radio with her powerful and hypnotic voice. It invaded schools, where textbooks were rewritten to teach racial biology and Aryan superiority. It took over leisure with films, posters, and youth organizations. Ewa Paradies grew up immersed in this torrent. She was a young woman in Germany in the 1930s when the Nazis consolidated their power. Probably, like millions of other German girls, she joined the League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Mädel, or BDM. There, the indoctrination was total. It wasn't just a social club. It was a factory for future mothers and wives of the Reich. They were inculcated with blind obedience, loyalty to the Führer, the importance of racial purity, and physical preparation for the coming war. Imagine that environment, the narrative reflects, as if speaking directly to our consciousness. Your entire reality, from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, is shaped by a single message. You are special. You are superior. Your nation is great and destined to dominate. And all around you, there are enemies who want to destroy you. You are taught to distrust, to hate. You are taught that compassion is a weakness, that pity is a bourgeois and decadent feeling. Your heart hardens layer by layer, like ice that forms in a lake in winter. For a young woman like Ewa, probably from humble backgrounds and with few prospects in life, this message must have been enormously empowering. Suddenly, it wasn't just Ewa, just another Pomeranian girl. It was Ewa, the Aryan woman, the vital link in the chain that would lead to the millennial greatness of the Third Reich. The BDM uniform gave him a sense of belonging, of purpose. It gave him an identity. And when war broke out in 1939, that sense of duty intensified. Men were leaving for the front, and the war machine needed hands. The factories, the administration, and also the concentration camps. The SS began recruiting women for guard posts. It was not just any job, it was an honor. It was a direct way of serving the Reich, of protecting it from its internal enemies. For many, it was also a way to escape the monotony of domestic life, to access a position of authority and responsibility that in traditional Germany would have been denied them. Ewa Paradies volunteered or was recruited. We don't know for sure, but we do know that in 1944, at the age of 24, he arrived in Stutthof. And when she crossed that door, all the abstract theory of hatred that had been instilled in her since she was a child found the concrete reality of her victims. He did not see human beings. He saw the embodiment of everything he had been told was bad, inferior, dangerous. He saw the Jewish subhuman women, the Slavic slaves. Ideology had provided him with the glasses through which to look at the world, and those glasses distorted people into objects, in insects, and insects can be stepped on without remorse. The countryside did not corrupt her. she has already arrived corrupted by the poison of National Socialism. Stutthof simply gave him the perfect setting and total impunity to unleash the darkness within him. It allowed her to go from being a believer in the ideology to being an active priestess of evil. The girl who once ran through the streets of Lauenburg had disappeared. In her place, there was the guard, the torturer, the woman who found in the suffering of others not only a duty, but a perverse pleasure. Theoretical hatred had turned into practical cruelty, and his laboratory was the punishment block, where ice water was his preferred reagent. Chapter 3. The Ice Water Ritual. The Strafblock, Stutthof's punishment block, was not just another barracks. It was an entity of its own, a malignant tumor in the already diseased body of the camp. Located in an isolated area, the mere mention of it sent a collective shiver down the spine. There, the minimum rules of survival that applied in the rest of the camp were suspended. There, death was not a consequence of hunger or disease. It was the declared objective. And at the center of this universe of pain, Iwa Paradies established her throne. It was not a chair, nor an office. His throne was the courtyard of gravel and mud in front of the barracks, and his scepter, a metal bucket or a rubber hose. The ritual almost never changed. It had the mechanical precision of an assembly line, but infused with the personal perversity of its executor. It started with a national team. Iwa strolled through the lines during the morning's endless countdown, the appel which could last for hours in rain or snow. His eyes, searching, were looking for a pretext, a look that he considered challenging, an uncontrollable tremor that he interpreted as weakness, a prisoner who would have coughed during the night, or simply a whim. A day when boredom or frustration will lead her to need to demonstrate her power. It didn't take a reason, Anya's voice murmurs in a thin voice. Sometimes he just pointed. His finger was a judge, a jury, and an executioner. If his finger landed on you, it was the end. You knew it. You felt an emptiness in your stomach, a dizziness. It was as if the whole world was vanishing around you, and there was only you and that finger. The victim was separated from the line and dragged by other prisoners, forced to collaborate under the threat of sharing the same fate, to the Strafblock courtyard. There, under the impassive gaze of the winter sky, Iwa gave the order. Ausziehen! Get naked! Forced nudity was an act of violence in itself. It was stripping women of their last layer of identity, of modesty, of humanity. He exposed her, vulnerable and trembling, not only to the cold of the air, but to the voracious gaze of her executioner and anyone who might be watching. Iwa would then stand in front of her. In his hands, the hose, or standing next to the barrel, from which the handle of a metal bucket protruded. There was a moment of silence, an instant charged with almost unbearable terror, in which only the panting of the prisoner and the faint rustling of Iwa's boots on the icy gravel could be heard. And then it began. The first impact of the water was such a brutal shock that the victim often lost his breath, unable even to scream. It was a pain that could not be located. It was total, enveloping. It burned like fire, but it was an icy fire that spread across the skin, contracted the muscles, and seemed to freeze the blood in the veins. Ewa didn't discharge the water in any way. He did so with a studied methodology. It directed the jet to specific areas, to the back of the neck to cause a blinding headache, to the soles of the feet, a place of extreme sensitivity. to the genitals in an act of humiliation and deeply sadistic torture. Sometimes he would force the woman open her mouth and direct the stream directly at her throat, choking her at times, causing her to cough and vomit ice water. Bucket after bucket, Anya describes, and in her voice you can hear the chattering of teeth she remembers. The body begins to fail. The tremors are so violent that you think your bones are going to break. You no longer feel your hands, your feet. They are blocks of ice attached to your body. The initial pain gives way to a deadly numbness, to a terrible heaviness. You want to scream, but your jaw is stiff, frozen. You only make guttural sounds, like a wounded animal. Meanwhile, Paradies watched. His face, usually expressionless, could show a hint of interest, even satisfaction. It was not anger that moved her, but a clinical and twisted curiosity. He studied the body's reactions. The exact point at which a woman's eyes lost their focus and became clouded with impending unconsciousness. Sometimes he would come up and talk. His words were not shouts, they were poisonous whispers that slipped over the sound of water. "Not so strong now, right?" he could say. "Where is your God? May he come down and save you." Or the cruelest of all, "If you hold on one more minute, I'll let you go." It was an obvious lie, but in the cold, clouded and pain-clouded mind, it could be the bait that kept the woman conscious a little longer, prolonging her suffering for a fictitious hope. There was one episode, remembered by several survivors, that encapsulates the nature of their cruelty. A Hungarian Jewish prisoner, a middle-aged woman who had been a concert pianist, was selected by Iwa. The reason? She had been caught wiggling her fingers on a flat surface, as if she were playing a piece by Mozart in the air. To Iwa, this was an act of insolence, a vestige of a humanity that needed to be eradicated. He forced her to kneel naked in front of the barrel of ice water. "Play for me," Iwa ordered sarcastically. "Play me a song with your artist's fingers." And then he began to pour the water, bucket by bucket, over his hands. The woman, with superhuman dignity, kept her hands outstretched, her fingers curved as the water froze them. The bones creaked. The skin turned blue and white. She didn't scream. He sobbed silently, his eyes fixed on a distant point. Perhaps on a concert hall in Budapest, on another time, on another life. Iwa, frustrated at not being able to break her spirit, ended up pushing her head first into the barrel, holding her underwater until the movement stopped. The artist died, but she did not give him the spectacle of defeat that Iwa craved. This was the ritual. It was not a punishment. It was a theater, a representation of absolute power over the body and soul of another human being. Paradies wasn't just a guard carrying out orders. She was a director, an actress, and the only spectator of a drama whose only final act was death. And every time the ritual concluded, with an inert body being dragged through the mud, she reaffirmed herself, not as a woman, but as an instrument of the Reich, as a dark goddess on an altar of ice and pain. Chapter 4. The Ice Witnesses. The Stutthof camp was not a monolith of silence. Despite the terror, despite the machinery designed to atomize and isolate, tenuous, almost invisible networks of humanity persisted. They were whispers in the darkness of the barracks. A piece of bread passed from hand to hand furtively, a name muttering in the night to remember someone who had already left. And at the center of these networks, stories circulated, warnings, names that had to be feared, and the name of Iwa Paradies and her ice water ritual was repeated like a nightmarish refrain. The prisoners developed a survival instinct, sharpened by fear. They learned to read the body language of the guards, the tone of their voice, the expression of their eyes. With Iwa, there were unmistakable signs. A particular sparkle in his eyes, an almost imperceptible smile at the corner of his mouth, a slower pace in his passage during the appel. They were the omens that the cold show was about to begin. We learned to make ourselves small, recalls the voice of Zofia, another survivor, whose testimony is intertwined with Anya's. When he approached, we lowered our heads, held our breath, wanted to merge with the person next to us. We prayed that his gaze would not rest on us. We knew what had happened to Ruth, the seamstress from Warsaw, or Lena, the young woman who was only 17 years old and who missed her mother so much that she cried silently every night. Both had been chosen, both had been bathed, and both had been taken, unrecognizable and blue, to the crematorium. The fear of Iwa Paradies was a living being that breathed next to them. It was not an abstract fear of death, which was a constant companion. It was a specific, personal fear of particular agony, of methodical humiliation, of cruelty with a name and surname. This fear united them in a tragic bond. They became forced witnesses to the destruction of their companions. His ears kept forever the screams drowned by the water, their eyes the image of bodies convulsing in the mud. Their memory became the only cemetery for those who did not have a grave. And in the midst of this horror, there arose acts of courage that defied all comprehension. Some prisoners, risking their own lives, tried to interfere with Iwa's sadistic ritual. One of them, a woman named Clara, who had been a doctor before the war, devised a desperate method. When a prisoner was brought to the Strafblock, Clara and a few others managed to get dry rags, and, if they were incredibly lucky, some straw or brown paper. If the victim survived the bath and was dragged back to the barracks, semi-conscious, they would pounce on him. They rubbed their limbs with frantic energy, trying to reactivate circulation. They rubbed his hands, his feet, his back. They wrapped her in rags, snuggled her between their bodies, sharing what little warmth they had left. It was useless, most of the time, Zofia admits, with a sigh that is almost a lament. The cold had penetrated too deeply, but we did it anyway. It was an act of rebellion. It was our way of saying to Ewa and to the countryside and to the whole damned Reich, you won't have his soul. You won't have all of us. Seeing Clara, exhausted, rubbing the purple feet of a woman who was no longer responding, it was seeing an angel in hell. She knew it wouldn't do any good, but she did it for dignity. For the dignity of the dying woman and for his own. These acts of silent resistance were the antithesis of Ewa's world. While she dedicated herself to dehumanizing, they, in an act of pure will, reaffirmed her humanity. While she used the water to torture, they used their own hands, their own breath, to give warmth. It was a miniature war, fought in the shadows between compassion and cruelty. But power was still in Ewa's hands, and his creativity for evil knew no bounds. On a particularly frigid January afternoon, he selected 3 women, mother and daughters, who had tried to exchange a portion of bread for a little salt. He forced them to strip naked and tied them with wire to a metal pole in the yard. He placed 3 buckets filled with ice water in front of them. "Drink," he ordered. They're thirsty, aren't they? Drink until it passes. The women, shivering violently, were forced to swallow the icy water. The spasms in their stomachs were visible even from a distance. They vomited, and Ewa forced them to continue drinking from her own vomit, mixed with the ice water. The youngest, a teenager, lost consciousness first. The mother screamed, pleaded, but Ewa just poured the contents of a bucket over the unconscious girl's head. The three died there, tied to the pole, their bodies turned into grotesque sculptures of ice, a mute reminder to the rest of the camp of the price of disobedience and of the absolute power of the young god who had turned water into a weapon of mass destruction. Chapter 5. The Anesthesia of the Soul. What was going through Ewa Paradies' mind as she watched a woman freeze to death? What did he feel when his ears caught the last moan, when his eyes saw life go out in a glance? Was it pure sadistic enjoyment? Was it the satisfaction of a duty fulfilled? Or was it something more complex, more somber? To understand the torturer, we cannot limit ourselves to cataloging her as a monster. Fictional monsters are simple. Human beings are a labyrinth of chiaroscuros, even the darkest ones. Ewa was not born with a rubber baton in her hand. Nazi ideology had provided him with the framework, the permission. But the execution, the personal detail of her cruelty, came from a deeper place within her. Life in Stutthof, for one guard, was a surreal and deranged existence. On the one hand, the absolute brutality of the camp. On the other, normal life in the SS barracks, just a few hundred meters from misery. They could have a hot meal for dinner, drink beer, listen to music on the radio, write letters to their families. There was an unfathomable cognitive chasm between the two realities. To survive psychologically, to not go crazy, they had to build walls. Very high and very thick walls within their minds. Ewa Paradies perfected this mechanism to the extreme. For her, prisoners were not women with stories, with children, with lost loves. They were Stücke, pieces. They were Figuren, figures, or puppets. They were objects, and objects can be given a use. They can be broken if they are no longer useful. The ice water ritual was, in his distorted mind, a form of cleansing, of purification, or simply a particularly effective method of discipline. He had completely anesthetized his empathy. Sometimes you saw her laughing with other guards, Anya recalls, with a mixture of revulsion and perplexity. He laughed at banal things, a joke, of a dress. And one wondered, how can it be? How can he, half an hour later, be torturing someone to death and then laugh again? It was like I had a switch inside. He turned off his humanity when he walked through the door of the Strafblock, and turned it back on when he left. This dissociation was the key to their emotional survival, but it was also the door through which the purest evil slipped in. By denying the humanity of its victims, it denied itself its own humanity. He became an automaton of terror, an instrument. And like any instrument, it could be used with terrifying coolness and efficiency. There is no indication that Ewa Paradies felt remorse. On the contrary, there are testimonies that he enjoyed his reputation. She liked to be feared. The fear he inspired was, for her, a form of respect, of power. It was a confirmation of its importance in the countryside ecosystem. The more his methods were talked about, the more he reaffirmed them. Let's imagine their routine. In the morning, the appel, where his mere presence generated palpable fear. Then their round of the Strafblock, the selection of the piece of the day, the ritual of water, the subsequent cleaning of his boots if the mud had splashed them, perhaps a bureaucratic report where he noted in dry language death from heart failure or death from pneumonia, and then dinner, beer, the letter to his family in Pomerania, where he surely spoke of the harsh winter, of work, carefully omitting the nature of such work. I hope you are well. Here everything goes on its course. I do my duty for the Führer and for Germany. In that double life, in that capacity to compartmentalize, lies one of the most disturbing lessons of the Holocaust. No fanged monsters needed. It is enough for ordinary people, corrupted by a toxic ideology and protected by impunity, who are capable of extinguishing their conscience and turning horror into an administrative routine. Iwa didn't see herself as evil. She saw herself as a patriot, a strong woman doing unpleasant but necessary work. That was the biggest lie she told herself, and the most dangerous. Evil does not always come with a bang. Sometimes it comes with the soft sound of measured footsteps on gravel, with the jingle of a metal bucket, with the whistle of a hose. And the worst thing is that, for those who exercise it, it can feel like just another day at the office. Chapter 6. The End of the Ice Kingdom. The winter of 1945 was the harshest in living memory on the Baltic coast. The cold, that tool that Iwa Paradies had used with such sinister mastery, turned against her kingdom. The sound of Soviet cannons, at first a distant and almost mythological murmur, grew closer day by day, until it became a constant and threatening thunder that made the earth vibrate under your feet. The end was approaching, and with it, even greater chaos. In Stutthof, the machinery of death accelerated. The SS, aware that their time was running out, tried to erase the evidence. The crematoria worked at full capacity, day and night, but the smoke could no longer hide the truth. Orders came in to evacuate the camp. Not out of compassion, but to prevent prisoners from being released and from testifying against their executioners. Thus began the death marches. At the end of January, under a biting blizzard, thousands of prisoners, weak, sick, and barely clothed, were forced to march westward into Germany. Those who stopped due to exhaustion, those who stumbled, were executed on the spot. The landscape along the route was strewn with frozen corpses, dark silhouettes on the white snow. For Iwa Paradies and the other guards, this was a terrifying transition period. His authority, which had previously been absolute within the barbed wire, was now challenged by an unstoppable external enemy. Order was breaking down. Many SS guards and officers, anticipating the worst, fled, changed their uniforms for civilian clothes, and tried to blend in with the retreating German population. It's hard to know what Iwa's last days in Stutthof were. Probably the ice water ritual became less frequent. The priority was no longer methodical torture, but self-survival and the destruction of evidence. It's possible that, amid widespread panic, she too was trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy, a final assertion of her power in a crumbling world. On May 9, 1945, Soviet Red Army troops liberated Stutthof. What they found inside was beyond imagination. A few thousand prisoners, living skeletons clinging to life by sheer miracle, abandoned to their fate because the Germans had not had time to evacuate or kill them all. And the tests. Mountains of shoes, glasses, suitcases, the crematorium still warm, the barracks infested with diseases, the smell, always the smell, now mixed with the scent of freedom, but too late for many. For Ewa Paradies, the Ice Kingdom had come to an end. There is no heroic record of his capture. Most likely, like so many others, he tried to flee, hide, disappear into the chaos of a defeated and occupied Germany. But justice, though slow and imperfect, began to move. The testimonies of the survivors, of women like Anya and Zofia, became weapons. Their voices, which Ewa had tried to silence forever, were now raised to accuse her. The Allies, and later the Polish and German authorities, began the search for the Stutthof criminals. Ewa Paradies' name was on the lists. She was arrested, tried, and convicted for her crimes. The executioner who had played with the life and death of hundreds found himself at last in the dock, forced to answer for his actions. His reign of terror, based on cold and water, ended where it always had to end, before the law. Chapter 7. The Judgment and the Echo of Silence. The courtroom was a world away from the mud and barbed wire of Stutthof. Here there was no room for sadistic arbitrariness, only for the law, slow, methodical, full of papers and formalities. Ewa Paradies sat in front of her judges. She no longer wore the bluish-gray uniform that invested her with power. She was wearing the simple clothes of a defendant. His face, which had so often shown an impassive coldness, was now pale, perhaps confused. The world had turned upside down. Now she was the peace. She was the one being watched. The trial was one of many post-war trials against the Stutthof criminals. It did not have the worldwide repercussions of the Nuremberg trials, but for the survivors, it was of paramount importance. It was the vindication of his suffering. It was the official confirmation that what they had experienced was not a nightmare, but a crime, and that criminals would pay for it. One by one, the witnesses took the stand. Women who had rebuilt their lives as best they could, but who had Stutthof tattooed on their souls. Anya, Zofia, and others whose names were lost in the archives, but whose words weighed like rocks in the room. They talked about the cold, of fear, of the figure of Ewa Paradies and her obsession with ice water. They described the ritual with a detail that made your skin crawl. The sound of water coming out of the bucket, the color of the skin when it freezes, the laughter of the accused. Faced with these accusations, Ewa Paradies was, according to the records, cold and negative. He showed no emotion. He showed no remorse. He limited himself to denying the charges or minimizing them, hiding behind the excuse that he was only following orders. He was the cowardly defense of many of his teammates. But the orders did not demand the level of personal cruelty, the enjoyment, the meticulousness with which she had carried out her work. The orders did not dictate that he laugh while a woman froze to death. The verdict was predictable. Guilty. Guilty of murder. Guilty of complicity in murder. Guilty of crimes against humanity. The sentence, death by hanging. There are no records of his last words, of his final thoughts. We don't know if, on the scaffold, in front of the gallows, the wall he had built around his soul finally cracked. He did feel, for a second, a spark of remorse as he faced the same end she had imparted to so many. Or if she clung until the last moment to the ideology that had blinded her, dying convinced that she was a martyr for a perverse cause. His execution put an end to his life, but not to his story. Because the story of Ewa Paradies does not end with her death. Finish with the survivors. It ends with the echo of his silence, a silence that paradoxically speaks louder than any scream. After the war, women like Anya and Zofia had to learn to live again. To live with the memories, with the cold that never completely abandoned them, with nightmares in which the sound of tap water could trigger irrational panic. They got married, had children, built homes. But Stutov was always there, a shadow in the depths of his eyes. For them, the trial and execution of Ewa Paradies were not an act of revenge. Revenge is a fire that consumes. For them, it was an act of justice, necessary but insufficient to heal his wounds. The real victory was not in the death of his torturer, but in his own life, in every dawn they saw in freedom, in every hug they gave to their loved ones. Each time they told their story, breaking the silence that the Nazis had wanted to impose. Ewa Paradies wanted to reduce them to numbers, to objects, to silence. But he failed. Their voices, their testimonies, have transcended time. They are the slab that weighs on the memory of the god who turned water into poison and cold into his personal weapon. They are the eternal reminder that even in the darkest realm of ice, the spark of humanity can survive, and in time can reignite the fire of life. Chapter 8. The Weight of Memory. The gallows had done its job. The body of Ewa Paradies, the god who had sown terror in the frozen heart of Stutov, ceased to exist. But earthly justice, though it had been applied, was only a fragile dam against the unstoppable tide of memory. For the survivors, the release was not an endpoint, but an ambiguous question mark in the midst of the devastation of their lives. Leaving Stutov did not mean leaving Stutov behind. The countryside followed them, glued to their skin, embedded in their minds. An emotional parasite that had forever altered their way of inhabiting the world. The journey back home, or to what was left of it, was often as traumatic as deportation. There were no overcrowded carriages or screaming guards, but there was a thunderous emptiness. Many set out on foot through a shattered Europe, walking skeletons moving by inertia. They arrived in their villages, their cities, and found houses occupied by strangers or simple empty lots where their life had existed before. Entire families erased, neighbors, friends, all turned into smoke. They were ghosts who returned to a world that no longer belonged to them, carrying an absurd and imposed guilt for having been the ones who survived. Anya, whose voice has guided us through this hell, returned to Warsaw. The city was nothing more than a sea of rubble. He walked through streets he barely recognized, looking for the building of his childhood. He found only a pile of bricks and twisted beams. He sat down on what had been the threshold of his house and wept. Not just for the loss of their home, but for the loss of everything: his family, his innocence, his faith in humanity. Liberated, but more imprisoned than ever. Chained to memories that were like blades. People wanted to forget, explains his voice, now with the bitter wisdom of the years. They wanted to rebuild, to look forward. And we were a living reminder of what had happened. A shame, a hindrance. They told us, you have to move on, don't think about that. But how can we not think? How can we forget the sound of Ewa's hose, the smell of burning flesh? My mother's look when we were separated on the ramp? We become islands of pain in a sea of voluntary amnesia. Silence became his new prison. They kept quiet so as not to disturb, so as not to stir up the past, to try desperately to fit into a normality that seemed grotesque to them. They got married, they had children, but they were often ghost mothers whose hugs could be too strong, whose gazes were sometimes lost in a distant horizon that only they could see. Survivor syndrome gripped them, the guilt of being alive when so many, like those who froze to death in Ewa's water, lay in mass graves. Zofia, on the other hand, was never able to have children. The cold of Stutthof, the privations, had damaged his body irreversibly. Every time she saw a mother with a baby, she felt a sharp pain, a mourning for the motherhood that had been stolen from her. She took up sewing, as she had before the war, but her hands, which had once tried to warm the dying, now trembled slightly. Every winter, when the cold cut through the air, it was an ordeal. The simple act of washing your face with cold water could trigger a panic attack, an instant regression to the Strafblock's courtyard. For them, the news of Iwa Paradies' capture, trial and execution came as a distant echo. There was no joy, there was no celebration, just a deep stillness, a pending business that was finally closed. But closing the case in a court of law was not the same as closing the wound in the soul. Iwa's death did not bring her victims back to life. It did not erase the scars. It was an act of abstract justice that could do little against concrete and everyday pain. Memory manifested itself in the most insidious ways. In dreams, always dreams. Recurring nightmares in which they ran away from a female figure with a bucket, running down an infinite corridor of barbed wire. In the smells, the smell of freshly baked bread could transport them suddenly to the ferocious hunger of the countryside. The smell of bleach, of the cleanliness of a hospital, reminded them of the sick barracks, the place from which no one left. And water, always water. A heavy rain, a lake, even the water in the bathtub could instantly evoke the deadly cold and laughter of his torturer. They learned to live with one foot in the present and the other in the past. They built a shell to function, to smile at their grandchildren, to cook dinner. But beneath that armor, the echo of Stutthof resounded every day. Iwa Paradies could have been executed, but her legacy of horror lived on in the psyche of her victims. It was a ghost that didn't need to be alive to haunt them. He had achieved, in part, his goal. He had frozen a piece of their souls forever. Chapter 9. The Anatomy of the Shadow. What does the figure of Iwa Paradies tell us about the nature of evil? His case forces us to abandon the comforts of fiction, where the villains are easily identifiable by their appearance or their grandiloquence. Iwa was not a one-piece demon. She was a human being, a young woman, a product of her time and lethal circumstances. To unravel its moral anatomy is to enter uncomfortable territory, because it implies recognizing that the capacity for horror is not alien to the human condition. The first component, and perhaps the most crucial, was ideology. National Socialism was not simply a political party. It was a totalitarian belief system that reconfigured reality. It provided a mental framework that justified the unjustifiable. By stripping the prisoners of their humanity, labeling them as Untermenschen, subhumans or vermin, he removed any moral barriers. A woman, a mother, an artist is not being tortured. It is being disinfected. It is eliminating a plague. It is defending the homeland. This rhetoric was not a mere ornament. It was a psychological mechanism of self-protection and justification. Iwa didn't see herself as a sadist. She probably saw herself as a patriot, performing an unpleasant task but necessary for the survival of her people. The second component was context and impunity. Stutthof was a closed universe, a microcosm where the laws of civilization had been suspended. There, power was absolute. There were no outside witnesses, no accountability, no consequences for cruelty. This environment of total impunity is a breeding ground for the worst of human beings. It acts as a greenhouse for darker impulses, allowing them to grow and flourish without restriction. What in a normal society would be repressed or punished, in Stutthof was not only allowed, but in many cases rewarded as zeal and loyalty. Ewa could give free rein to her impulses without the slightest social or legal restraint. The third component, which is more difficult to define, is personal choice and predisposition. Ideology and impunity corrupt, but not everyone in the same way. There were guards at Stutthof who, though part of the system, did not indulge in torture with the same sadistic enthusiasm. Some carried out their duties with bureaucratic coldness, others with brutality, but few showed the level of inventiveness and personal enjoyment that characterized Ewa Paradies. This suggests that within it there was a predisposition, a seed that found in the field the perfect soil to germinate. Perhaps a deep need for power and control, an innate lack of empathy, or an internal rage that found in the prisoners a safe target to unload. The countryside did not create its evil, he freed her. The banality of evil, a concept coined by the philosopher Hannah Arendt after Eichmann's trial, is fundamental here. Arendt observed how evil can arise not from a grandiose monstrosity, but from the inability to think, to empathize, to see the other as a human being. Ewa Paradies was, in many ways, a banal person. She was not an evil genius, but a mediocre woman who found in the structure of the camp a way to feel important, powerful. His wickedness was not momentous. It was administrative, routine. He reduced himself to filling buckets of water, giving orders, filling out reports. It was the evil of indifference, of blind obedience, of the normalization of the atrocious. Finally, there is the mechanism of dissociation. In order to do what she did, and then return to her barracks, eat and write letters to her family, Ewa had to develop a superhuman ability to separate the two realities. In his mind, the Strafblock courtyard and his private life were watertight compartments. This division allowed him to function, but at a terrible cost, the anesthesia of his own soul. By denying the pain of others, she denied herself the ability to feel. She became an empty shell, efficient in her role as a torturer, but dead inside. Ewa Paradies was not a supernatural monster. It was the result of a lethal formula, a dehumanizing ideology, plus a context of absolute impunity, plus a personal choice of cruelty, all wrapped in the banality of routine and sustained by an iron psychological dissociation. His figure is a dark mirror in which we can see reflected the terrible potentialities that nest in the human heart when all the dams of compassion and ethics are removed. It shows us that hell is not built by demons, but by ordinary people who, drop by drop, bucket by bucket, extinguish their humanity. Chapter 10. The Voices that Overcame Silence. If the Nazi strategy was dehumanization and oblivion, the ultimate resistance of the victims was memory and words. Despite the machinery designed to reduce them to numbers and then to smoke, a handful of voices were determined to survive. not only physically, but as witnesses. His testimony became an act of war against oblivion, the only possible grave for the millions who did not have one. Immediately after liberation, even in the midst of chaos and weakness, some began to write. On stolen pieces of paper, in the margins of books, in their own minds, they scribbled names, dates, events. They were the first drafts of history, written with the urgency of someone who knows that he must leave a record before his memory is clouded or the world decides to look the other way. Over time, these voices gained strength. In the 1950s and 1960s, the first memoirs began to be published. They were raw, direct, unpolished stories which often clashed with the discomfort of a society that wanted to turn the page. But they persisted. They attended trials, such as that of Paradies, and testified. In front of the judges, in front of the defense lawyers, in front of the impassive gaze of their former executioners, they repeated their stories. Each testimony was a victory. It was to take away from the Nazis their ultimate goal, silence. At first, talking was like reliving the pain, Zofia's voice confesses. Every word was a stab, but we did it for them, for those who couldn't. For the Hungarian concert pianist whose hands were frozen by Ewa, for the mother and her daughters tied to the post. If we kept quiet, they died a second time. If we talked, even through pain, we gave them a kind of eternal life. Their suffering would not have been in vain. These testimonies were not only used for justice, they served for history. Thanks to them, we know the intimate details of horror. We know what an ordinary day was like in Stutthof. We know the taste of watery soup, the weight of the rubber truncheon, the sound of Paradies' boots. Without these voices, the history of the Holocaust would be just statistics and bureaucratic documents of the SS. They gave it back the human face. They put a name and surname, fear and hope, to the number tattooed on the arm. In the decades that followed, their struggle was transformed. From telling their story to condemn, they went on to tell it to educate. They visited schools, spoke with young people, participated in documentaries. They saw how the world slowly began to listen. They saw how museums and memorials were created, and most importantly, they saw how the next generation, their children and grandchildren, took over from memory. For them, this transmission was an act of healing, incomplete but vital. It meant that his burden would not be forgotten, that the warning of what human beings are capable of doing would still be alive, that the names of the victims and also those of the executioners like Paradies would not be lost. They became beacons in the fog of history, reminding us that civilization is a thin and fragile layer, and that barbarism is always lurking, waiting for its opportunity. His legacy is a mandate to remember, not with a passive memory, but with an active, committed one. To remember in order to recognize the first signs of intolerance, hate speech, and the dehumanization of those who are different. Remember so as not to repeat. To remember in order to honor the incredible strength of the human spirit, which even in the most extreme conditions was able to find glimpses of compassion, solidarity, and indestructible dignity. They, the voices that refuse to be silenced, are the most powerful antidote to the oblivion that Paradies and her regime tried to impose. Chapter 11. The echo in the present. The crematorium of Stutthof is silent. The empty barracks rise like wooden ghosts against the Baltic sky. The camp is now a museum, a memorial, a place of pilgrimage for remembrance. Tourists walk through its streets with respect, some with tears in their eyes, reading the information boards, trying unsuccessfully to imagine the unimaginable. The wind continues to blow, but it no longer carries the smell of death, but the saline aroma of the nearby sea. It seems like a world away, a closed chapter of a nightmarish story. But the shadow of Stutthof and of executioners like Paradies is longer than it seems. Its echo resonates, subtle but stubborn, in the challenges of our present. The first echo is that of ideologized hatred. Ewa did not act out of pure evil. She acted on a belief system that told her that a group of people was inferior, dangerous, deserving of persecution and death. Today, in our societies, we continue to see how discourses emerge that with varying degrees of intensity seek to label, stigmatize, and dehumanize groups. Immigrants, refugees, religious or ethnic minorities, political dissidents. The mechanism is the same: to create a pure and good us, as opposed to an impure and threatening them. It is the very seed that, watered with fear and crisis, can grow into the poisonous tree of genocide. The second echo is that of indifference and trivialization. Paradies' evil was able to thrive not only because of those who acted, but also because of those who looked the other way. For the German society that preferred not to know, for the nations that closed their borders, for the international community that acted slowly. Today, we face our own temptation to indifference. In the face of the tragedies that occur in other parts of the world, in the face of the injustices at our doorstep, it is easier to change the channel, scroll down the screen, lock ourselves in our bubble of comfort. The normalization of hate speech on social networks, the frivolity of history, the "it's over, let's not talk about it," are modern forms of that same indifference that allowed Stutthof to exist. The third echo is the most insidious: the erosion of truth. The Nazi regime was a master of propaganda, of manipulating facts, of creating alternative realities. Today, we live in the era of disinformation, fake news and algorithms that lock us in echo chambers. When objective facts are questioned, when truth becomes relative, the foundations of any rational debate and any defense of human rights are undermined. Without a shared truth, it is impossible to point out evil clearly. Visiting Stutthof today or reading about it is not a mere exercise in horror archaeology. It is a mirror. It forces us to ask ourselves, where are our fledgling Stutthofs? Where are they being built, brick by brick, with words of hatred and acts of exclusion? Are we the ones who look the other way? Are we the ones who normalize? Or are we the ones who, like the survivors, have the courage to raise our voices, to bear witness, to defend human dignity in the face of every form of growing authoritarianism and intolerance? The Stutthof Memorial is not just a reminder of the past, it is a warning for the future. It tells us that the battle between humanity and barbarism was not won in 1945. It is fought every day, in every decision, in every word, in every act of indifference or courage. The cold that Paradies imparted with her buckets of water was physical. The cold we should fear today is the one that can freeze our hearts and our compassion. Chapter 12. The Last Heartbeat, a Letter to the Future. We are nearing the end of our journey. We have descended into the depths of horror and have witnessed, through the eyes of Anya, Zofia, and others, the resilience of the human spirit. We have analyzed the anatomy of evil in the figure of Paradies, not to understand it, since evil is essentially incomprehensible, but to recognize its mechanisms and its masks. And we have heard the echo of Stutthof in our time, a reminder that history is not linear and that progress is not a guarantee. Now, in this last chapter, there is no simple conclusion. There is no moral that wraps this story in a loop and leaves it resolved. All that remains is an open reflection, a question thrown to the wind, a letter addressed to the future, to you who have come this far. Imagine for a moment that you are one of those prisoners. You have no name because the name has been taken away from you. You only have one number. You're cold. You have a hunger that devours you inside. Your body is a set of pains, and you see a young woman approaching with a bucket of ice water. You know what's going to happen. You know it's the end. In that last moment, what do you think about? On your child's face, in the sun of a distant summer? A prayer you didn't think you remembered anymore? Or does your mind empty, surrendered, accepting unreason? Now imagine that you are Paradies. You have the bucket in your hand. You feel the cold of the metal through the glove. You see the woman trembling in front of you. Her eyes beg you. What do you feel? Nothing? A tingle of power? A spark of doubt that you extinguish immediately because it is weaker than the duty that has been instilled in you? What is needed to lift that bucket and pour its contents? This duality, this capacity for good and evil, is at the core of the human condition. Stutthof was not an anomaly. It was a laboratory where the extremes to which our species can go were demonstrated. And her lesson is not that we would all be like Paradies in those circumstances. That's a dangerous simplification. The lesson is that some were, and that it is our collective and individual responsibility to create a world where the circumstances that lead to it do not happen again. The survivors' heritage is not only their testimony of pain, but their testimony of life. They, who lost everything, found the strength to rebuild, to love again, to bring children into a world that had failed them so catastrophically. His life is a resounding yes to existence, as opposed to the absolute no of Nazism. That is why this letter to the future is, in fact, a call for vigilance and compassion. Vigilance to detect the discourses that divide, the policies that exclude, the small seeds of intolerance that can grow into forests of death. Vigilance to defend truth, democracy, and the inviolable dignity of every human being, regardless of their origin, creed, or condition. Compassion so as not to harden our hearts, to reach out to the different, the vulnerable, to those who flee from their own modern Stutthof. Compassion is the direct antidote to the dehumanization practiced by Paradies. It is the ability to see in the face of the other a reflection of our own, to recognize their pain as our own. The last beat of this story is not that of the hearts that stopped in the mud of Stutthof, nor that of Paradies on the gallows. The last heartbeat is ours. It is the heartbeat of memory that refuses to die. It is the heartbeat of the responsibility we assume when we know this story. It is the heartbeat of hope that, learning from the past, we can build a future where the cold is not a weapon, but only a season, where water is not an instrument of torture, but a source of life, and where the names of the victims are remembered not with horror, but with the solemn promise that their sacrifice was not in vain. May his memory be a blessing, and may our action, inspired by their testimony, be the legacy we leave to generations to come. The trip to Stutthof ends here, but the journey of memory and of the struggle for a more humane world has just begun.